So thank you all for coming. I'll just kind of introduce myself and a little bit of what I do, and then we'll get right into some of the context of what we're going to be talking about today, which is an introduction to design thinking. So a little bit about me and what I do. I work for a company called Splunk. Splunk is an enterprise data company. So if you see anything from our customers include companies like Apple, Aflac, um, plenty of like say racing companies like McLaren. And our objective is to ingest petabytes of these different kinds of data and make it into human digestible format so people can run decisions. So when you look at, say, things like dashboarding and you're pulling in, again, huge context of lots of data, how do you find the most important data for you as quickly as possible so you can perform some kind of action? We do that through things like, say, incident remediation. So if something goes wrong with your infrastructure system, if you think of Facebook's outage that happened, I think like 6 months ago, problems like that are things that we deal with, along with just having this log system that you can pull all this information, use AI learning so that you can get people to the insights that matter to them that are correlated to data that they care about. And so as a product designer, we kind of look through that and for some reason that page isn't showing. Let me just go ahead and just show this. So it's skipping one slide for me. There we go. This is just going to be this one slide, but this is an example of a real dashboard we do for McLaren, as for instance. So when they are doing their simulation training, we take a lot of the information and build really beautiful dashboards that they can run decisions off of. I think they mentioned that in their qualifying the customer that we have for that, they ingest, I think, 3 petabytes or so just for like qualifying. So you can imagine the huge amounts of data that they're generating that they need us for. When I first started, I originally started out as actually an application developer. So what got me into UX and just kind of talking through that was I had a project that I did in my bachelor's program as an application developer, where we partnered with the Indianapolis Motor Speedway to actually create this cool augmented reality experience where you could take an iPad up to a car and it would generate this 3D augmented engine underneath of the vehicle. And so the idea was that, you know, someone could take that up, you could click on these little buttons that are underneath of here. So like these little things here, and what it would do is it would show and highlight components of that engine that you could learn about. So this was it was a success. We ended up showing this at the performance racing industry showcase with about 11,000 exhibitors. Went really well. But the thing that kind of bugged me in the back of my mind when I was going through all this, and the way I presented it to people was that you could use this to, say, give it to an engineer and they could take that iPad up to any car and then eventually like break out the components of that engine to find things that matter for them. And I did like wireframes at the time just to kind of concept, just kind of, again, my first experience doing anything UX related. But then afterwards I had questions, and those questions were, okay, well, I showed this really interesting idea to showcase, but what's the intention of the technology if I was going to actually implement this inside of a real product? So if I wanted people to pay money for me, like engineers actually at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway to use this. And a lot of questions came up that I really didn't have answers for at the time. And the questions were things like, you know, if I have the iPad in my hands, I have if the engineer might be wearing gloves, and if you're wearing gloves and you're not going to be able to use, say, a touch screen. If my hands are covered in grease, holding that iPad and being able to move that around to see those individual components really isn't that useful for me. If I want to see a granular view of that engine, what granularity does the engineer need? So what I mean by that is certain components of an engine may be a couple millimeters thick, while others may be, like I said, that giant plate that you saw highlighted in the picture. Um, so how do you know what to show and what's important to show? And then finally, there's thousands of moving parts in the engine. So how could you sort through all that effectively or group those to what the engineer wanted that was most important to them? Um, and that really got me thinking about and pushed me into my master's program where I worked more into product design and user experience. Um, and the question that raises for us really is, how can we ask the right questions to build the right kind of products? Um, if you're starting out and you're coming from a place of focusing on the technology, you may end up in a situation like I do, where I was so ingrained with the technology that I really didn't understand how to break that out to make it say profitable. And I did bunches of projects like that again through college, where I worked with companies like PBS and American Academy of Pediatrics, where I built really cool showcases, but not things that would sell. Um, what I equate this to, when you're working through this, is I like to think of design thinking kind of like the way that a scientist would go about and approach the process of building an app. Or no, sorry, a scientist wouldn't build an app, but a testing a theory, right? And that's that they have a hypothesis, they see something that goes on in the real world, they perform some kind of observation. They say, well, we see this and we're gonna look more into it. They perform some kind of research around it to validate what they're seeing. They or at least a research plan to get started. Then they test an experiment around that, so they may change variables that are of interest to them. They analyze the data and then they report their conclusions on if it was successful or not. And a part of design thinking, when we're talking about the term design thinking, is that we should be thinking about this in terms of design is this toolbox that we can pull specific actions from to resolve some kind of problem that is user-centric, right? So regardless of the stage I'm at, which we'll go through the stages here in a moment, I can say, at the scale of an enterprise organization versus something as simple as like a 3-man team, or a problem, the complexity of a problem being an enterprise level complexity solution, where you have Google with, billions of people using their devices, all the way down to a couple of really specific users, you understand what tools fit where in your process. Um, this is a very like standardized view that we see, and if you're taught like in any program, they'll show you something like this. There are 5 major disciplines that you go through in design thinking, that are I consider them disciplines because there are people who work at my company that are dedicated to say one of these, who have done this for years and years. But there is the need and generalization that you should understand all of these topics broadly when you are a designer. Um, so the first one is empathize. So who is actually using my product? How can I understand their use case? So again, starting back to that point when I was talking about with the um, the engine that I was working with. How can I understand what's happening with it and who's using it? If an engineer versus say like just a person in a showcase holding up an iPad app. What do stakeholders think, which is something a lot of people forget. So people who are in your organization or just your partners who you say use an API with. How can I understand the underlying user problems? From there, once I empathize and I understand them, how can I define it and say what are the most important problems to address? And if again, depending on the complexity of your issue, an enterprise, you may do a research study where we're dealing with hundreds of minute of problems, all of various scale. So how do I define what are the most important patterns that I'm trying to solve for? And how do I start building, say, these artifacts that we can have conversations around, such as user journey maps, personas, empathy maps, those kinds of things. And finally, like what are competitors doing in the same space to try to do something about it? And then next one is ideate. So breaking it out into user stories and saying, hey, we're trying to do X, Y, Z. So if I'm that example, as an engineer, I want to be able to do, let's see, as an engineer, I want to view individual components of my aircraft engine, or not aircraft, car engine. That's like a story and a feature that I need to think about, and then I build that through like low fidelity wireframes. And then what people generally like, again, younger user experience designers have the most experience with prototyping and prototyping, which is what you would normally assume with UI components and design systems. And then finally test, which is how do I quantify that through doing some kind of validation. Some of the individual pieces of that I'll go through really quickly. Empathize is user research methods, aligning stakeholders. Define is synthesizing that, like I talked about, in problem statement. When I say problem statement, you should do some synthesis around your hypothesis, and a problem statement should be very specific to the problem that's trying to be resolved, and should be based around the synthesis that you've built up to this point. Ideate, which I said, user stories, flow diagrams, and wireframes. Prototyping, which is actually when you go into Figma and start building out high fidelity wireframes, design systems at the bottom where it's like your margins and things like that. And then testing, which is your usability studies and your telemetry data analysis. When I say telemetry, that's just a fancy word for your user analytics, say if it's a public platform that's been built out. For this presentation, at least, I'm going to focus primarily on empathize, because it's the area I feel most junior UX designers, especially when we're doing interviews and things like that. It's the area that I test, that I notice people lack the most. And you may say, like, well, how do it's like anything, right? Well, it's empathy, right? How hard can it be? And you'd be surprised how complex it can be to get everyone, say, like, understanding your stakeholders, understanding what you don't know, and applying that to a problem that you can actually solve. That's really the question that you'll get. And, as a junior designer, I had the same thing, which is, I asked this question. I was like, what's the most important skill for me to actually be a UX designer? And what do people miss if when I go into, like, say, an interview or trying to get a job? Um, and the answer is, well, you just need to have more empathy, right? You need to have a strong sense of empathy in your work. Um, and to me, we start thinking about that and we say, what does empathy actually mean? How do you begin to really, like, quantify what being empathetic means in your designs or in your research process? There are three parts to that, which is how you understand. So, how can I be a better listener and ask the right kind of questions for people? Again, I said narrowing down to the problems that matter. Interpreting, so saying what's why versus the how. So, a lot of UX designers who are just starting out, they'll interview participants and they'll look for what we call low hanging fruit, which are very simple, like simple things with simple answers. And what they'll do is they'll say something like, I have an example later on, but the user will say, I want a messaging service in my application. And they'll take that at face value and say, the user wants a messaging application in their product. Instead of diving into that and saying, okay, well, what is the why underneath on why you're wanting that? Um, is it because of, your team member is halfway across the world they will reply maybe in 6 hours, or are they in the office next door and I need like a really quick response to this problem, but I just can't go get to them, right? So diving into that question to really understand the underlying need. Um, and then finally connect. How do I balance user goals with the context of my team's objectives? Um, so if again, in the area I work in, um, we have stakeholders that I work with, maybe 15 people on my like immediate team, but it goes all the way up to the area I'm in, which is observability is what we call it, but it's up to like 500 different people working in this area. So if I have an idea or context around something, um, how do I match what I'm understanding from my users and empathize that with what my team is trying to do as a whole? Um, Designed to create critical thinking artifacts. I like to say that design, let's see what time I'm at. I'm at 8:48. Okay, I'm still pretty good. Um, the way I like to think about it is designers some to this is just like a generalization, but it's the idea that designers need to be critical thinkers. I agree with that, but I also believe our objective and our goal as designers is to create artifacts that promote critical thinking. So when we do things like journey maps or personas or a wireframe, it's not us critically thinking, just the critical thinking part of it and like deciding things, but building an artifact that I can give to other people, like a project manager and an engineer, and have them have a discussion around it to make an informed decision about what the product should be. And if there are challenges or things that we're not thinking about that are happening with our system or our users that they are unaware of. That reflects too when you're actually in the job environment. So if you are, I've, when you start out at a place, you'll sometimes see this where it's like, our users want a biometric sign-on for mobile, a messaging service, like I just mentioned, a snapshot feature to save screenshots in our mobile app, viewing repaired engines on their phones. Um, Whatever the question might be is feature specific. And what you want to do is kind of reverse engineer that concept to say, okay, let's take a step back and say, what are they actually trying to address? And it reminds me of this episode in The Simpsons where Mr. Skinner is trying to understand why children are acting the way they do. But uh, again, the project managers may build a feature out, they test it, and no one's using it. And it's kind of like this: Am I out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong, right? It's it's the users who are wrong. And so grounding that back and saying like, what's the underlying reason behind these features and what we're trying to resolve, and then going to those customers or to those users and being poignant about those questions that we're trying to ask um, is our goal, I would say, as like product designers or UX designers. Um, to jump that through, the do's that I encourage people to do, again, if you're doing a case study or you're in an interview where, they ask you to do a whiteboarding session or just even ask questions about the organization, consider who your audience is, align them with your stakeholders and partners, define what you are not solving. I think I mentioned that earlier, but if I have a problem with hundreds of different things we're trying to do, even just specifying what are some of the problems we're not worried about right now, we're only focusing on these individual issues, is important. Focusing on user-centric pain points, narrowing down your problem statement, and set what the acceptance requirements are with, say, like a project manager or engineer. The don't, and what makes me this is for product designers. For UI designers, it may be a little different. But when someone just says, is on Dribble or sends me their portfolio on Dribble, and it's, I found out that users want to trade in crypto, right? That's not solving any issues for people. That's just a it's an observation, but you've done no problem statement and no testing. Therefore, I don't consider, or I won't look at your portfolio if I'm honest. Like, I'll see that and I'll just be like, okay, they didn't really dive into the problem. So if I give you something like a really complicated problem with dozens of different maybe potential personas and user stories, I'm gonna assume that you wouldn't know how to do that because you're not showing your process um, in your portfolio. You're just showing UI. And again, showing UI skills is good, but that's again one pillar that we're talking about here, and you're missing the 4 other pillars. Before we jump into an actual like exercise, is there any questions or comments about anything I've gone through so far? I don't want this just to be one way. Just leaving some time for people to ask anything.
I am not seeing any questions in our chat right now. Everybody, if you guys have any questions, feel free to go ahead and hop into the under events category, channel live or chat live events and ask your questions.
Okay, cool. Again, if any of you have questions, don't feel afraid to ask. Questions are good because there's probably other people wanting to know the same thing. Cool. So I want to do this exercise with you guys, and I'll leave some time for you to think about it. But this is a question I may ask someone who like we're doing an interview session with. And I want you to kind of, whether it's on post-it notes or you go to like the make a post-it note board out of your FigJam file, um, go through and think about what steps you would take if this was your first day at a company, and then kind of compare it to the way that I frame it, and see if there's differentiation or things that you can kind of learn between it, right? And again, if there's things that you see like, well, did you consider maybe like we should consider it another way? Um, that's perfectly fine. And like I would love to hear your thoughts on it, and then we could kind of go through and explain why I approach it one way and why you may be approaching it a little different. And sometimes there is no right or wrong answer in these cases. It's more just uh, we're evaluating how we critically think through a problem. Um, in most cases with this, again, when we're in interviews, we're not worried, and I've had conversations with hiring managers around this. We're not worried if you get the wrong answer. We're worried about you seeing that you critically think and know the steps through a process to get a logical conclusion out of something, or at least a line of logic out of it, so that you uh, know those steps and those pillars of design thinking that we talked about earlier. So, congratulations, everyone on this call. You've just now been hired by LocoFlow. So at LocoFlow, what we are, and I'll play the role of a project manager, but we're a tech startup for an aircraft manufacturing facility. And what we do is we provide really informative dashboards that help people diagnose and repair their defective engines. We use the data collected, say, by our customer, and right now we're a startup. So we have one customer, Flytech, and they are going to we build helpful dashboards that help track their repair progress of those aircraft engines. And from that, in our first customer, and what we're showing is that we've actually made repairs 30% faster. So what I'm curious about is uh, if you could write down, again, like on post-it notes, if you were going to join on a first day, how would you go through this and start like asking particular questions about this company that got you a better understanding of our stakeholders as well as our users? So, any questions about that before I leave, like for a couple minutes for you guys to write some stuff down?
Can you actually oh, sorry. Can you just
Mhm.
repeat the questions?
Yeah. So my questions is again, if you're joining Locaflow for the first time, so you're starting your first day tomorrow. Just imagine that. And the question is what questions would you ask to understand our users? And what questions would you ask potentially to our stakeholders to understand what they're trying to solve for at Locaflow? Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So I'll leave up to maybe 9:01 just to kind of think through this. Mhm. On this, so who are my users? That's actually part of the question. I'm wanting to see if you like what questions would you ask from this paragraph here that would help you understand what users are using this. So I'll go through that actually here as the next step, but I want to test here if what would you use to understand what users are actually here? Like if I asked you again in an interview, um, I would ask something like, "Do you have any questions about our company?" All right. I would want to hear you kind of talk through and ask questions about what would help you understand what our users are from the paragraph here. I think that's actually what he's again, I would write those down. So with the like if you're on the post-it notes for that. How the numbers are what? Evaluated. Okay, good. So you guys are on the right track. I'll let it one more minute and then we can get going. So you guys are, so like the questions you guys are asking that you're giving me, they are on the right track, right? So when I talk about like surface versus like going deeper and deeper, this is what I'm kind of highlighting for you. So I think one of the questions is like, who's your target audience, right? Or what was the second one that he just said? Sorry, it's like escaped my mind for some reason. I'm having an Alzheimer's moment. Evan, what was it? Save me. Yeah, how is the numbers evaluated, right? Or yeah, the numbers evaluated. The idea is there. The way I would break this down, and yeah, I did this exercise myself to test how I would do it. This is going into understanding what I don't know as my first step of when I'm hired. And the way that I break this apart is I simplified it here. There's a concept for product designers called the business model canvas. That's a little more complicated. It's called, again, business model canvas, if you want to look it up. But it describes basically these three areas, which is like, who are your people? What channels do they get like the product from? What's the technology behind the stack? And, you know, is their what's their revenue model and stuff like that. And for this, I just simplified it a bit to say, I'm going to worry about what can I find out about this, about the people that are here, what kind of process they would be doing, and the technology stack underneath Locaflow. So let's walk through it. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight and I'm going to understand the people underneath the system. So I just took a marker like and highlighted and say the places that matter are Locaflow, which is my primary place that I'm working from, and that's hired me. There's aircraft manufacturing facilities, which are, I'm assuming that's our customer that we're working from. Train their employees. So that's where it gets a little vague for me. So when they say employees for me, I think, okay, well, is it the employees of those aircraft manufacturing facilities? And are there sub-demographics of those employees we should be considering and thinking about? And who are those demographics of those sub-employees? So in the example I have here, like managers, repair technicians, is there other areas? And I would ask this question again if I was in an interview with someone. Um, and in that case, like if we are worried about the managers and going into like process, is the information they are interested in more like the repair of the engines like conjoined together, like all of the context of that data as one thing? Or is it more like I want to monitor one single engine and the things that are happening with that single thing, right? Our manufacturing facilities. So this was something I caught, which was like manufacturing facilities. I think of manufacturing as the place it gets built, not as the place that repairs happen. So if are those the same things or are they different, right? Is that something that I have to worry about, that like repairs are happening in the same place as the manufacturing and therefore two different events, or the person who's doing this may have two different jobs that I should be thinking about, right? It's kind of like a puzzle picking this apart. Is Locaflow targeting smaller commercial aircraft facilities or say something bigger? So you could have something like defense manufacturing or like huge aircraft lines, right? So if I'm worried about who, like the scale or something like that, that would be a question to ask as well. So from the question you asked at the beginning, which is like, who's our target audience, right? You can see you're on the right track, but what I'm looking for again in an interview is like that one level deeper of being able to break this apart and start thinking about those underlying themes and really digging into the problems and what you can find. For process, I highlighted two-part, which was like the diagnosing and repairing of the defective engines, and then building helpful dashboards that track the repair progress. So it sounds like there's two things going on here, right? Which is like, if I'm diagnosing something, and repairing something, then the information shown to the user that I'm thinking about is more like, um, a process like step A, I fix something here. Step B, I fix something here. Step C, I fix something here. Versus dashboards to me is more like information about the thing that they're doing, right? So how does the dashboards affect like those step by steps, or is that step by step the same thing, right? And I'm purposely leaving this vague because this would be questions I'm asking to the hiring manager or to the person like a project manager or other people I'm working with. Other things like they use the term dashboards, right? Dashboards can be a lot of things. Is it like dashboards of the overall health of all engines or the repair progress of a single engine, which is again what I mentioned before. They use the term data collected, right? And I think one of you said this is like, well, what kind of data, right? Perfect. What kind of data do we collect and how is it leveraged by our system? If is there opportunities that you could look for other data that exists that we could start like grabbing to make more informed decision about that customer? What data does the user provide? So yes, we data collect, but like, is there manual steps? Like say, we know that they're at repair step A right now and they mark it as complete. Do we track that as like an option? Or is it more automated where there's like a device on the aircraft engine and by turning, say, the dial enough, then it marks it and says, hey, this, step has been completed, right? Like what are they using in the technology to actually like remediate the problem? Any questions about any of that before we go on to taking those insights and then building them into something that we can take to say like align stakeholders together? Any questions in the chat? Do you guys see it?
Quick
Just
question,
leaving it
actually.
Mhm.
So when you're asking these questions, when do you think, as like, because this is, you're more on like a discovery and trying to understand the situation, when do you think like you have too many questions?
But I mean, that's up to is this like during an interview is what you're asking, right?
Let's say, I mean, I guess in any situation, but I guess mostly during the interview process, because I feel like when you're asking questions,
Mhm.
I feel like the questions can almost be endless, especially if you're still learning about the company and trying to understand, its projects. So if a interviewer or a hiring manager happen to ask you this question, what are, if you can give like um, goals on the top questions or how many questions you should ask, what do you think that would be like comfortably
I
in terms
don't
of like
think like in my opinion, there isn't a limit. Like, I would be more worried about, again, people who aren't asking questions around it. Um, the way I view it is if something is off limits, right? Like, we can't talk about that because of confidentiality, right? Then the manager's just going to mention that, but I would be more like, oh, cool, like they're actually interested in the product we're doing and they have an idea about like some of the things that we're thinking about. Um, like when I was hired in my position, I, we had a conversation around, I believe it was the, they kind of abstracted it a little bit, like the scooter industry. Like, I don't know if you saw like all those bird lime scooters that like just popped up in San Francisco and stuff like that overnight. And we just had a conversation about how they data collect, and it was more like, oh, it's really interesting how they're doing that. I'm not really sure. Do you know how they uh how would they approach like this problem, right? Which is like people throwing the things into the lakes or things like that over time. Like how do you think that works with their business model? Um and just having more like upfront conversations or like um diving in deeper, it's okay in my opinion. I would mostly focus on the people aspect, and generally it's in my opinion, it's up to the hiring manager to steer that conversation. Because if they see that you're interested enough at that research phase and then they're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. We're I think we need to move on, and I would like to see you explain more about, say, your use case study, right? That's up to them to move the conversation forward. Does
Awesome.
that
Thank
make
you.
sense, or is that
Yeah.
answering your question?
Mhm. Thank you.
Leave another 20 seconds. I don't bite, I promise. Right. Don't worry, yeah, you'll, I, they'll just ban me from the Discord server. No, a single tear will drop down my, yeah. I'm sorry, Lord heaven. Okay. Okay, cool. I'll move on again. Like, if you have questions, I encourage you to ask them. I don't want this to be completely one-sided of me just talking all the time. So let's say that we have, we're at our first day. What's some things that we should be thinking about, like getting started? And again, I'm not going to focus on research methods too much in this presentations because I feel like you guys can learn a lot of that through Google. What I want to focus on is uh, aligning people together. So again, you can start building those artifacts to make decisions together if you're working with PMs or you're working with engineers or whoever. And the tool I use, go ahead. I don't know where I can post this. Is there a particular place you want me to post this in the chat, Evan, or somewhere? What'd you say? Sorry, can you hear you? No, I'm just gonna go through like the requirement exercise. So is there a place you want me to send this link to you guys?
Oh, also,
Okay.
Taylor, we have some questions in that channel if you'd like to take a look at that.
Sure.
Sure. So from Jules, so during interview, is it a good idea to propose a design using assumption, or should we try to collect more information by asking more questions?
Um, I would lean on the side of asking more questions because again, it depends on your um I'd say if you're like say a principal designer with a lot of experience in the area, then having more conversations that are based around what are the solutions that have been provided in the industry that match that, right? Um, then that's more appropriate. For most junior designers and like intermediate level, that's including myself. I focus a lot more on asking questions. And my assumption is most people who get to the interview process have already been kind of weeded out through their case studies. So they've already shown a demonstratable ability at the fundamentals, such as like showing a really good case study and showing a understanding of design principles like UI. So what I'm testing you on in the interview process is your ability to articulate, right? Um, so my assumption with that is I would much rather people be asking questions than say proposing like a design solution, unless the person who you're working with, like say your manager, um, directly like invokes you to, or not the person who's looking to hire you directly invokes you to say, what solutions would you provide? And even in that case, I would still probably say, well, I don't really think I have enough information unless I know X, Y, Z things.
Thank you.
Um,
So yeah, we have another question from Candy's Journey. So what
mhm.
exercises do you recommend that would help us learn how to dig deeper into design thinking?
It's hard, right? Because it's something that you kind of just you develop. I'm trying to think of good exercises. Um, I mean, the exercise like what I'm doing right now is something that I've like I went online and I looked at like potential problems that people have that people have, or user-centric issues that I've seen. And then what I do is I kind of just like build lots of questions and start thinking about, I don't know, that's a good question. If I'm honest, I don't know, at least at that level of like how to ask better questions. The way I'm doing it, like what I'm trying to show you right now, is like building a process out of saying like the way I do it, which again isn't how all designers do it. I think very few designers do it the way I do it. Everyone has a different process, but is breaking it apart by um blocks that you can think about things in terms of, right? So my template that I showed you is people, process, technology. Um, and depending on the scale, if it's an enterprise, like a business model canvas that says um, customer problem, channels that they get, relationships, customer relationships, such as how you like communicate with your customers if there's like issues with your product. Um, I use all of that as backing for my conversations. So I mean, I would look at business model canvas is what I use. Um, or again, people process technology and just work on going through that and like digging it in deeper into your brain. It's taken me years and years and years of practice, and I still don't feel like I'm nearly as good as like a principal or a senior that I want to be.
Thank you.
Well, think we have 10 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and just share this Figma file. And again, we may not get through this. Um, if there's questions, I'm going to prioritize questions over this. But I just want to show this in like how I would approach if I was joining a company for the first time and thinking about how to align people. And again, this isn't really interview related. It's more like if I was the first day, what would I do to understand like what the project managers want and what say engineers are thinking before I go and actually talk to users. Thanks for posting that, by the way, Mandy. So what I've done at this point is I have taken what I wrote. So I want to understand these three things, like the questions that I asked, like say in my interview. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to translate that into this framework that you see on the right. If you want to duplicate this and like use it on your own, you go up to this little arrow icon at the top of your screen, and then there's that little duplicate button here. Um, So I encourage you to duplicate into your own Figma file if you want, and use it. I'll just be walking through what I'm like, how I would frame this, but and this is an alignment tool that I use in FigJam to like, I sometimes have like 8 or 10 stakeholders, which gets ridiculous to try to like organize people around. So what I do is I use this framework to say, do we agree on the users? To copy it, you're probably going to need to, like I said, go up to duplicate. But do we agree on the users? Do we agree on the use case of what's driving them to use our product? Is the market ready? Which means like, is, you know, not to get too into detail, but the Apple Newton technically had a touchscreen back in the 1980s, but you know, it did catch on because the technology wasn't ready for it. Aspects of competitors we can learn from. What are people doing about it? And then implementation, which is more, I'm going to try, this is more poignant, like if we're at a point in the process that we already have ideas and I've already done some research, I would do some like implementation questions, which I'll phrase here in a minute. But let's still go into step 1. Do we agree on the users? What I'm going to do, and the way this works normally, is I'd have everyone sit down in a room together and I'll fill out the question. My first question that I'd probably ask, based around my people question, is, and again, I'm going to be opinionated to get people's responses, even if I don't know what I'm talking about. And what I mean by that is I don't know the organization structure that well, and I'm going to make a something that could be completely wrong, and that's okay. I just want to see if people strongly agree or strongly disagree with me. So I think I mentioned before about the persona archetypes of the different people. So I'm going to phrase this as repair workers use the same solutions as managers and administrators. And this is based off the local flow questions we were doing before, just a reminder. So in this case, what I'm trying to fish for is, do we have a solution here that's like, we're mostly concerned about the people on the line that are maybe like repairing an aircraft or the engine, or are we interested in more like, do we have a separate solution for someone who's like a manager of these people? If we don't, have we looked at it as an opportunity, as something we want to pursue? Like, you know, a view on our app or our web app that lets me see like the conjoining of all these stakeholders, who are making sure that aircraft is being repaired and being sent out to the proper distribution channels. And so what you do, if I unhide this, is you would have them go through an alignment scale. And so you may get a response like, again, if I'm playing the part of a PM, I really don't agree with that, because our repair technicians don't care about the overall health of multiple engines. They just have a single aircraft engine to repair. And I'm making this up, but it's just like something someone decided at a time. And this gives me insight. I would just look at that and be like, oh, you know, that gave me insight to say that the way people are using the product currently, they're not repairing multiple aircraft engines at a time. They're just repairing a single engine. So I never thought about that before. So I may iterate on that to ask more poignant questions. And I would do that for a lot of these. Let's see how much time I have. I have 4 minutes. I'll phrase this another way, like when we go to, do we agree on the use case? And again, all of us would be sitting together in a meeting, kind of going through each of these questions to make sure I'm understanding what my stakeholders in my engineers and project managers think about the product and the team that I'm just joining. And I may ask other UX designers to do this as well in the organization if it's an enterprise level. So viewing an aggregation of how fast all engine repairs are completed is more important than individual when viewing individual orders, Again, down that same logic line of the conjoining of multiple engines together as a metric versus an individual piece. Have them vote on it and see what they think. And again, I would go through all of these questions. So a market question might be something like, I'm just showing you examples right now. You can change these to fit whatever your context you're trying to do is. It's more just to explain the kinds of questions I will be asking. So is the market ready? This would probably be like one step further. I may not even ask this question because I don't know enough at this point, but if I understood more about the system, I'd be asking, like, as an example, I'm brought into the organization and they have the opinion that we need a new feature in our app for those business stakeholders. Sorry, not business stakeholders, for our managers, not for the people who are repairing the engines. So they have that opinion, think that way, but can they do that already, say with like another product or something like that that they can already solve it for? And what value are we providing that's additional that they could just be using, say, like another thing to solve with? I don't want to get too much into it because this is starting to get like very, very specific. But that's kind of like the structure is I would use something like a template like this to get what I need out of my stakeholders or other people. And then what I would do is I would use that information to say, okay, these are the questions I don't know still. And I'm going to start taking those to users to understand if like in an interview, if this is matching their thought process or there's dissonance between the stakeholders' opinions and the customer's opinions. Does that make sense? I think we're about out of time. Mhm. What I what I would say too is and why I'm including stakeholders so much in this process, and like I keep mentioning them, is one of my failures when I started out as a junior designer was one of the things that I was most proud of that I ever built never got implemented. I spent probably like 5 months, 6 months actually building this really complicated, really interesting documentation experience. And I didn't include stakeholders. And so what ended up happening was, again, it was probably one of the best things I've ever built, but because I didn't like include them in the process, there was a lot of questions. And because it was so complicated, of a thing that we were making, it made them very scared of building, like completely reworking our documentation experience, basically, right? And so the question became like, okay, well, we're not going to do, we're just not going to do it. And, thank you for your time. Thank you for building it. We're done. And so it was a learning moment for me where there's a thing called the IKEA effect, actually. And it's the idea that, if you're in IKEA, if you ever built something from IKEA, they give you the instructions and they just make you build it yourself. But they do that because the act of building something, even though you're not the designer, you didn't design the little toolkit for your fucking TV stand. They make you sorry about that, sorry, cuss, but like you for the TV stand, the act of you building with it makes you feel like you're a part of the process. And so if you include stakeholders early and make them involved and invest their time into what you're doing, then they're more likely to have investment, not to just turn your product, even if it's not like they don't agree with your product, they've invested time into it and they're not going to just toss it to the side. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining today. Again, this is Taylor from Splunk. He is actually one of our members here. He helps us with portfolio reviews, and he's going to be joining us for a coffee chat later on in the future. Actually, it hasn't been announced yet, but next Thursday, we're going to have a live portfolio review with one of our other members, and Taylor is going to be our speaker. So if you guys want to know how we run our live portfolio reviews and how we review your portfolio, jump into next Thursday. We're going to have the event posted very shortly. And thank you again for joining us today. Hopefully you've learned a lot. We're going to keep the channel chat live events open for the end of the night. That way, if you guys want or to see any of the resources we posted in there, go ahead, take a look, bookmark them, and we will see you next Thursday. Thanks, you guys.
Thanks, everyone.